Just umzuzwana. Ndicela nje umzuzwana ukwenzela uba ndizokwazi uthatha ilink le ipha ku-YouTube ndiyibeke phaa phakathi kwamandungwane ukwenzela uba izohanjiswa yona. Excellent. So that is done. That is done. The link is on YouTube. Everything siyibekile ku-YouTube. Masibulele ke Mandungwane uba selapha iyaqalisa ke ngoku i-event esinayo. Mandiyivale ke okokuqala le picture siyibekileyo apha ebonisa uba simalunga nantoni namhlanje. Molweni Mandungwane. Molweni, siyanamkela Mandungwane kwincoko yokuqala yasecaleni komlilo, the first fireside chat yesizwe sikaNdungwane. Igama lam nguDumisani waSondlo. Apha ke kwaNdungwane, kwaDiya, kwaBhejula ndibizwa ngoba nguJongxolo. AJongxolo, ekholwa ukhe ndizikhahlele nam. Siyambulela ke uThixo obangele ukuba lo mhla ube ufikile. Mandithabathe eli thuba ndikhahlele kumandungwana onke, ndiwabize ngenkosi yamandungwane ebambeleyo ndithi agcine izibele. Kananjalo mandibulele kwisigqeba i-National Executive Committee yesizwe sikaNdungwane sikhokelwe nguNkosi uZwelabathembu. Ndibulele kananjalo kwi-ofisi kaSosiba Jikelele ngokundinika eli thuba ndithi Zanemvula, sinondwendwe ke olubekekileyo apha phakathi kwethu namhlanje. So xa amandungwane behlangene enkompeni kubanzi Kofivaba September 2024 avumelana ukuba ngoku sabugxotha buphele nya ubuhlwempu apha phakathi kwesi sizwe. We agreed that we'll use every available inch of land to do two things: to feed ourselves, to build our skills. One, to feed ourselves. Number two, to build our skills. That's why we are here today, to sit emthunzini walomthi mude kangakanana, to listen, to ask questions, to learn and to grow. Ndizawuqala ndilwazise undwendwe olu sinalo. Kuzawuthi ke akugqiba ukusinika imfundiso sithabathe ixesha simbuze imibuzo. Ndiqinisekile ke Mandungwane ukuba ninayo imibuzo. Siza kuyivala ke le program phango 8:30. 8:30 sayivala ngqi. Akukho noba sithi imizuzwana nje emva koko. Xa kuleli thuba ke mandikwamkele Jola, mandikwamkele Qengebe Mphankomo apha kweli khaya lakwaNdungwane kwaDiya kwaBhejula. Khulula ibhatyi mpondomise. Ungakhathazeki xa lisithi xa litshona ilanga lanamhlanje sibe sonke sesikubiza Bhejula. Umnumzana uWandile Sihlobo Mphankomo uJola uyi-Chief Economist yakwa-Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, AgBiz. Ungumbhali weencwadi ezimbini, A Country of Two Agricultures, The Disparities, The Challenges, The Solutions, kunye nencwadi ethi Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity and Agriculture. UJola ukwangumhlohli omkhulu obalaseleyo kwisebe lezoqoqosho nakwezolimo kwidyunivesithi yaseStellenbosch. Umhlekazi lo ukwangumphandi olundwendwe eWits University School of Governance, aphinde abe ngumphandi weziko lezentlalo noqoqosho, Institute for Social and Economic Research kwiYunivesithi yaseRhodes. Umhlekazi uSihlobo wonyulwa njengelungu lebhunga lokucebisa umongameli ngezoqoqosho, Economic Advisory Council kaPresident, xa wayeseneminyaka nje 29. Oku kwenzeke emva kokuba esebenze ukucebisa umongameli kwezobuyekezo lwezomhlaba nezolimo kwi-Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture ususela ngonyaka ka-2018. Andizami ke ukuninika i-age yakhe umhlekazi. Umhlekazi ukwalilungu lebhunga lwenkcukacha-manani loMzantsi Afrika, which is Stats South Africa, Statistics South Africa, kananjalo ukwangumkomishinala wezolawulo lwezorhwebo kumazwe ngamazwe malunga neSouth Africa, i-International Trade Administration Commission of South Africa. Mr. Wandile Sihlobo ungumbhali wemihlathi kumaphepha i-Business Day, i-Herald kunye nemagazini i-Farmers Weekly. Veki neveki ungamva ethetha kwi-podcast yakhe ekwi-internet ebizwa Agricultural Market Viewpoint with Wandile Sihlobo. Ujola lo uqengebe unesidanga i-BSc in Agricultural Economics yase-University of Fort Hare, aphinde abe nesidanga esingasentla kuneso esibizwa ngoba yi-Masters of Science in Agricultural Economics e-University yase-Stellenbosch. Phankomo dlisa ke nazi izimvu akunike zona umdali. The platform is yours kuwe uba ubeke i-visuals if ufuna ukwenje njalo. Njengoba bendishilo ke uzawuthi ke owugqiba uthetha sicele ukhe sikubuze nje imibuzo then ke sizawuyivala iprogram. Inkosi Phankomo. Mandivule ivideo yakho.
Enkosi kakhulu. Zange nake ndaziva ndisaziswa ngalaso ndiyabulela kakhulu ngale introduction ondiphe yona. Ndiyabulisa kuwo wonke umuntu osijoyinileyo, kwaba balapha na kwabanye abantu abasijoyine online ku Facebook, ku YouTube nakuzo zonke as platform. Ndizibona ndilapha nje nami ndimenywe nguye nusihlalo wale ntlanganiso naloyo organizayo kunye nomzala wam uSisamvanxa olapha kwi-call. And andinikwanga i-brief kuthiwe hayi namhlanje i-fireside yenu yokuqala, so ndivumelekile uba ndingathetha nangantoni na. And what I thought I would do then is to take a little bit of a moment this evening to report uba sime phi na noqoqosho lozolimo, starting firstly ngokwase South Africa broadly, and then perhaps maybe ngokuza apha ephondweni. The reason ndisenza kanje, starting with a bigger picture, is that anything that we aim to do apha nasephondweni nakwezinye indawo esihleli kuzo, ultimately it depends kwi-policies ezithile ezenzeka la phezulu. Take my remarks utilizing a few visuals because I see the light is not as good where I'm sitting at. I'm sitting in the Free State at rates. We here for some of the farmer matters. Let me flag a few slides so that at least you can follow the remarks that I will make much more appropriately. What I think perhaps maybe would be useful is this way: to just take a moment and look at where we are today, 30 years into democracy, because ultimately noba sithetha ngezolimo or senzanto na, agriculture is not a standalone. It does link to a lot on what's happening in the economic space. And I think the reality eyoba sime phina elqoqoshweni in general, you all probably got a clear flavor of it sometime last year when former President Mbeki went to the Freedom Square in Pretoria. And he gave the speech, which I consider it to be an important speech, where he was reflecting on South Africa 30 years into democracy. Amongst many things that he said that day, he focused on the issue of the economy, where he looked back on the first 15 years, where the South African economy was growing at over 3% on average at that period. The municipalities were working, the roads in many places were in a relatively better conditions. And I think in general in the country, there was a lot of hope in that first 15 years until the Pulukwana situation happens and coinciding with the financial crisis. The change in the political rhythm of the country from that time, the global financial crisis, the state capture, the COVID-19, the floods in Durban, and many other things added and categorized and characterized a lot of what we saw in the last 15 years, which in my view, I would describe it as both the period of a mismanagement as well as unfortunate circumstances. So it's a misfortunes and a mismanagement period. That's the last 15 years. Now, in a situation like this, I think where we find ourselves, all of us sitting on this call, and program director njengebetshilo xa ebeyivula uba nithe xana nihlele ecofa imvaba nacinga uba what must happen ngoku kungahlalwa nje ecaleni. And I think much of that comes from the whole thinking about how do we get ourselves to the first 15 years where abantu babe xa befuna umsebenzi bayifumane, izinto eSouth Africa zasenzeka, kwakukhona ithemba, and things seem to be working reasonably well. And one of the sectors then that abantu, in their search for hope and search for the opportunities, tend to look at is this story of agriculture. Ayinini nodwa apha kwaChucha abajonga into ye-agriculture. Nationally, everyone is looking into this. And I think in our attempt to understand why suddenly there's this interest in the past 10 years or so of talking about into zezolimo, forgetting a little bit about the historical perspective of it, I think le graph uyibonayo apha phambi kwakho escreenini, it does mirror that. Let me quickly explain eyona nto icacisa kakuhle ngoba uyazibona zonke
Xolo Nqamhlekazi, khayibeke ku-presentation mode benze siyibone kakuhle igraph.
It is sitting on presentation mode on my side. Let me attempt to do a bit of a fixing. On my side, I was already sitting there. I am very sorry about that. I was already sitting on presentation mode. Let me do this, the quick screen share and see what's happening. I seem to be at a space where my screen has failed me and locked. It will get back just in a moment. If you could give me just a second. Are you still all, or am I still audible that side?
Kakuhle kakhulu Mhlekazi.
Okay, I'm just having my screen frozen this side, but it will get back just now. Let me just sort that out. Okay, program director, I'm just gonna quickly shut this off this side. I'm not sure what my problems are. I'm gonna log in just now. I very apologize about this.
No problem. Sizawushiyeka sithule sonke asizukwenza kangqolo because of the recording. Masimphi ithuba.
I'm very sorry about that. I hope now I am audible, and I will just try to share my screen again, and hopefully it will show fairly well on your side. If you could confirm if it is indeed now on a presentation mode.
Excellent, excellent, sir. It is.
All right. Thank you so very much. So the point I was in was that if we begin to ask ourselves a question of why are we talking about agriculture today then in the context of getting ourselves better to where we were? I think much of this lies on the fact that this is a sector that has performed reasonably well compared to some of the sectors of the economy. Xa mining, uqala ngo-2019, ngo-2014, even in the latter part post-COVID-19, the mining sector has had its own challenges. And I think we see the same underperformance on manufacturing and only the tertiary industries that try to perform as good as what we are seeing in agriculture, as you see it there on your left-hand side on the screen, that it is one of the sectors that has seen much significant levels of growth. But I think that's not the overall explanation. The second part of it is, of course, the fact that if you think about the problems of South Africa, unemployment, poverty, inequality, and low growth. And I think when you look into the rural part of South Africa, especially looking at that profile of unemployment, it is true that a lot of people were not as fortunate to receive all of the higher education that some of the South Africans have. And ultimately, the only way we can absorb as many as they can is within agriculture by focusing on that. But not only focusing there on trying to make everyone a farm worker, but trying to say, can we also link with the agro-processing so that whatever that happens in that space, people can get even higher quality jobs up the value chain. I think at a national level, it is because of that justification on why agriculture is so important and the fact that it does have higher job multipliers, which means that ingaqasha abantu abaninzi kakhulu, which is why nanisiva kwi-NDP, National Development Plan, sithetha ngoba there could be 1 million jobs kwi-agriculture nakwi-agro-processing kwi-value chain yayo. In part, it was because of the performance. Enye yona nto yenza i-agriculture ibaluleke kakhulu yile nto yoba xa ungajonga yona uyiqalisa ngo-1994 usiza ngoku, especially emva kweendaba zale veki apho bekhona yonke into ye-Expropriation Act ekuthethwa ngayo and everything else. There's always this idea eyoba since kuphethe abantu abamnyama, agriculture is no longer doing well, certain sectors of the economy are failing, things are falling apart. And I think there are things that are falling apart. Many municipalities are failing. I mean, in our own province, Apo, Eastern Cape, down as needs is so there's a lot that we need to do. But I do think that with agriculture, we've done well as a country. This sector has more than doubled since 1994 in value and in volume terms. Ezona nto zicontribute kakhulu ekukhuliseni isebe lezolimo eyoba kuqwalaselisiwe kakhulu kwiinto ze-science, kwafakwa imali eninzi kwiinto ze-seed breeding uba kufumaneke imbewu entle eyona inokwazi ukusinika isivuno esikhulu in all of our crops. And the second part yile nto ye-genetics ze-wool. Abanye abantu bangazikhumbula into ze-BKB ne-wool program eyayisenzeka across the former Transkei. And I think i-programs ezinjalo kwi-genetics nakwi-seed breeding zincede kakhulu more at a commercial level. Kwinto yoba xa ujonga namhlanje ubi-South Africa iphi na kwinto zezolimo, we are the only African country in the top 40 global agricultural exporters. Ngo-2024, i-exports zethu for the first time zicrosse u-14 billion US dollars, not rands. And ngo-2023, sasikwi-record 13.2. Xa ujonga ezolimo, regardless of how you review the last 30 years, this is also one of those sectors that has done well. And I'm telling this long story because it begins to frame it on saying, if City South African economy is not growing,
we are thinking about restarting growth, job creation at a national level, and I'm going to come to the provincial aspect, then this is one of those sectors. And the sector lena etshintshileyo nangestructure. Ngoba ubujonga ngo-1994, 75% of farming economy kwangabantu abalima umbona, inkomo, i-dairy, and a little bit of sugar. But xa ujonga namhlanje, there's a lot more fruit that has been added, as well as wine, and that has grown significantly. And all of those are important because that's where also 60% of our farming labor is within this wine, as well as the horticultural space, fruit and vegetables. And their wages there are also even much better for many people. So in a way, the structure of our sector has changed. But the other important aspect about that changing structure is the fact that now we are providing these high quality niche fruits that the Western markets need. But of course, we know that the downside of some of these things is that they have developed in the former areas that were already commercial agriculture or traditionally part of the Union of South Africa, and you name it. Now, some of the areas that were in the former homelands have not done well at all in terms of the investments in long-term crops, which are high value and labor absorbing. If anything, ungadrive uqale konqobo uyomanga kolsikisiki ko-Flagstaff bizana ngumbona okanye kufuyiwe, but there's not a lot of a serious effort that has been done for within the long-term crops. Imakwati, which you may have different feelings. People may say it's still working, but in our judgment, from where I sit, I think it's failing. And the key question is about, do we have the courage to uproot Emakwa and begin planting fruits that are actually of higher quality, that can go to exports, can develop jobs and all of the other exciting things, because those entities, as well as Imajola and the others, are no longer where they were. And even if the Eastern Cape government can think they can pop money through the ECDRC, there's just no longer the demand and the value that used to be placed in those products. You need to structurally change those things if we are serious about reforming the Eastern Cape farming economy. But let me not dwell on that. I'm going to come into it in a minute. The point is that this sector has done well. It has even crossed the targets that we had in the NDP. You may not see well what I'm showing on the screen now, but the key point I want to put forward is that the orange bars are a number of fruits at the bottom, poultry and dairy and soybean at the top. The orange bars is what the NDP targeted. The blue bars is where we are today. There's always this talk that the NDP was never implemented, it failed. To a certain extent, that talk is correct when you are judging from broad national level and aggregating everyone. But in agriculture, that talk is not always correct, because what it shows here is that the blue bars have exceeded the orange bars, which is where the target of the NDP were, which means that the NDP has been implemented and it has actually done well. So the sector of agriculture has been flourishing. What is then relevant for the conversation of today is that although agriculture has flourished, but the fortunes of agriculture have not been shared well or evenly across all of the regions of South Africa. The former homeland of this country are still in the periphery of the economic progress. And I think this is why, in part, in your own gathering, you began having this conversation of what must be done going forward. You can't just sit without action actually being done about how to resolve these things. In this book, A Country of True Agriculture, we talk of a story that if you think about South Africa now and aggregating every activity that is happening, Black farmers in South Africa only make up about 10% on average of the overall output of agriculture. The key question then is to say, how do we begin to increase the level of contribution of Black farmers in agriculture? And this is one of the things that I think we must grappling with in the perspective of KwaChucha, but also grappling with in the perspective of a broader South African society. And I think when we begin doing that, there's always an attempt of saying, okay, how do you expect that Black people can contribute more than 10% when land reform has not happened, others still own all the land and all of the conversation, as we all know how it typically goes. But I think the other aspect we must have to face as a reality is that land reform has not been slow, as many people typically say. There's always this statistics that people send to us on WhatsApp. I think it comes from a TV segment that was once on ENCA at some point, which shows a statistic of about 9% or whatever the figure is that people say land reform is at. But land reform in South Africa is not at 9% of what has been transferred or what the ANC government bought from 1994 to today. If you add all of the activities of land reform, in addition to private transactions, which then is not an ANC or a government purchase, but it's a private individuals, they bought about 1.9 million hectares, which is about rounded off at 2 million hectares. Everything else and restitution adds up to about 19.3 million hectares, which makes it 25% of progress, not 9%. This is a figure that President Ramaphosa used in the SONA last year when he said land reform, the country has progressed. It is now at 25%. That chart that you see on your screen shows the evolution of land reform and where the 25% figure the president talked about, where he got that 25%, he got it from that figure. But I think what is relevant for the conversation is to say, if then the progress on land reform is at 25%, why the overlap with Black farmers only making up 10% of the commercial output? And I think the important aspect of that lies in the number that I've circled, which is the 2.54 million hectares. That is land that the South African government bought from white farmers in the period between 2006 all the way leading into August 2023. There's much more now. The figures have changed slightly as for last year's figures, but the point that stands is that there is that land. Where is that land today? That land is still sitting in the government's books. It's under Minister Nyonso's department in a program called under the program called Proactive Land Acquisition Strategy, but it is sitting on the government land holding account now. That is land that was previously used for commercial farming. If you want to get a sense of how big 2.5 million hectares of land, you have to consider that the area that we plant in all of our grains and oilseeds. Today in South Africa, we plant all of our grains and oilseeds in about 4.5 million hectares of land. So if we were to bring into production 2.5 million hectares of land, that can change the whole fortunes of the sector, but that can also dramatically and in a positive way change the contribution of Black farmers to the overall production in agriculture in South Africa, more than the 10% that I talked about earlier. So I think when we are considering the whole talk about inclusive growth, it's not so much about taking what is owned by the other person and passing it to the other person. I think the starting point is the one that we have. The most important thing also about this land is that it is situated almost across all of the provinces of South Africa, with the Western Cape that has the least land. But if you look at the Eastern Cape, you look at KZN, you look at Gauteng, you look at Northwest, Mpumalanga, all of these provinces, Limpopo, they have a lot of some of this land. And I'm not even considering what is traditionally under what has been under the traditional authorities. If you were to bring that on, those numbers change and they move somewhere to around about 4.5 million hectares or so of really arable land that can come into full production. And I think in our conversation here, while you are starting as a family, and I think when you broaden it in a provincial perspective, you have to begin to say, how do you, Ningochucha, tap in part of that land that is underutilized for the benefit of growing the region that you are in, but also the province and nationally? Because ultimately, even if Nini Ninodwa about contributor ni farming commercially, whatever that comes up there, it gets to be counted as part and parcel of the output. So you are contributing to the bigger picture of South Africa of growing the economy. And I think when you are having conversation with Nayo, Minister Nyonso, at your various engagements, or Abantu Basa Department in a province, or wherever you interact with, or even the Premier of the Eastern Cape province, that's the starting point for me, would be to say, how do we get part of that land that is in the Eastern Cape transferred to individual with title deeds? The financing of it is not so much of a problem because we do now have the blended finance that is under the Land Bank. The blended finance is managed by the Land Bank on behalf of the Department of Agriculture. We were just talking now a few hours ago where I met with Minister John Steenhuisen. He's been addressing farmers here in the Free State, the beef farmers. And one of the key points that he was putting forward to them is how he intends to increase the size of the blended finance in the next budget vote of the department. Because he sees the need for more capital and affordable capital for commercialization of Black farmers and supporting the existing farmers in the sector. And I think when you think about that and you think about land, and also then asking yourself the question of what are some of the support structures that are in the Eastern Cape Department, and this can begin then to change the dynamics. But I think even more positively for me, it would also try to bring the whole aspect of the Eastern Cape conversation in a much more important context. I mean, we all know, and I know he's part of your family, Kwachucha, the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Mr. Mabuyane, he always talks about how agriculture is important in the provincial economy. And he is right about that. It is important. Because one of the things that we have to confront is that the auto industry in the southern parts of the province may not face the optimistic outlook that it did about 2 decades or so ago. The world is changing. The EVs and everything else that is happening in that space, and where the pace of South Africa on adjusting to that. But I think as that transition is happening, we have to entertain the aspect of saying, can agriculture also step in as the auto industry slightly struggles, at least over the near term, so that we have a balanced view of the economy. And I think that we have not been serious as the Eastern Cape on agriculture. We talk about it seriously, but we cannot point tangibly on useful things that we are doing for the commercial aspect outside of a few handouts that we do put in communities. And I'm saying it in that way because at least we have to be honest when we are talking sithetha sisodwa apha. And I think these are some of the things that we have to be serious about when we are having this fireside chat. And I think beyond that, one of the national things that we will have to lift, and these are important nationally and they are important in the Eastern Cape as well, is to say there has to be a conversation then apho ninga-invite abantu abafana noBonkosi Daimani of the Eastern Cape Province, HOD, azo-explaina uba i-Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan, which is a running government program. How does he begin to translate it for the provinces, but also it for regions? Because angayi-translate athi bathi eBisho, but if ndihlele Flagstaff okanye ndihlele eBizana okanye ndihlele eNgcobo okanye ndihlele eCofimvaba, I be thinking about the master plan. And I think they have to come up with granular and tangible programs that feed into this, that they need to do. Because it's not going Mr. Betrobak afternoon, John Steenhuisen, and that this is what we will continue with as the running theme of the policies and the programs at which the Department of Agriculture will do. And I think beyond ezozinto, into the animal health, zento ze-exports, zento ze-rural crime, zizawulandela and kufuneka senzile. And I think into yamanzi ne-rural crime ndingayinyusela kakhulu apho ngoba i-stock theft iyebiwa impahla eNgcobo nakwezinye indawo. And I think all of those things they have to be important and part and parcel of these sub-themes. So why am I bringing these as the big themes in here? I'm bringing these because you said this is a first fireside chat. But I think as these conversations progress, we'll have to begin to granularize and picking one theme by one theme, one theme. And then also thinking about it to say, if at national it says this, how do we think about it at a province? How do we think about it at a more local level? And the reason, in part, it has to link to the national policy is perhaps maybe two things. One, because then if we are able to trace back the pathway of that, we can also be able to trace the way at which we can find funding for it. But we can also trace the way at which we can come up with a justifiable and a clear plan to go and pitch either to investors or to CSI fundings and all of those things of people that can have capital to actually bring in and begin to granularize these things so that they are not only theoretical, they are linked to the bigger scheme of things, but they are also be able to be tangible plans. And then we are also able to think about the funding for them as well as the skill set that may be needed to re-engineer these things. And I think if we can do that, then perhaps we can be able to have a much more tangible conversation about how do we begin to resolve the key problems that I have showed earlier, where I was saying the South African economy ultimately struggles with a few parts of saying how do we regain the growth prospects that we saw earlier in the earlier decades, which is exactly where I want to back and show to say all of this is for the efforts of saying how do we get back to that period of a 3.6 growth in the macro space, but getting that back there with agriculture also playing its part. And there's many other things outside of farming that can also be done. And I think all of this is in the prospect of doing that. And I hope that in many of the conversations that you will have in this fireside chat, we can begin to have a clearer and a sharper focus towards those aspects. Mandibamba hapo, enkosi kakhulu.
Alala John. Hey, usityisile kule njikalanga. This ivula nje amehlo am ngendlela nje emangalisayo into endimamele usicacisela yona apha. Akhona ke amanye amandungwane nawo apha ku-YouTube njengoba kukho la alapha kule platform. Sizawuvula ke ithuba lemibuzo nje embalwa, kodwa ke bendicinge ndiqale ndicele usosiba jikelele wethu uba akhe angene because ukhona ulapha phakathi kwethu. Ndifuna uqiniseka uba andimtyholini uba ukhona. Ukuya ukhona. Bejula, khawukungene sive uba uzawuthini apha kundwendwe lethu.
Siyabulela kakhulu Ndungwana. We wish to thank Undwendwe lethu for availing himself, especially at such a critical time. Ebomini bamandungwana. Mr. Sihlobo, we do not take what you have done with regards to availing yourself for granted. And I have hope and have no doubt that this is the beginning of a long-term relationship where we will navigate some of the challenges that are faced by the various communities, challenges that are faced by the South Africans as a whole. Siyabulela kakhulu for what you have done. So maybe just to ask just maybe a basic opening question to say, what would you say are some of the key things that isizwe of our caliber who are at the early stages, who are intending to begin this journey pertaining to farming? What are some of the key things you would suggest to us usixhobise ngazo. And also kule mihlaba yase Eastern Cape zeziphi imveliso or zeziphi izinto ezi compatible kumhlaba wethu apha Eastern Cape, or even for that matter even in the other provinces, because AmaNdungwana, while AmaNdungwana amaninzi elapha Eastern Cape, which is our hub, but akhona nakwezinye provinces. Thanks. That would be my for now. Thank you.
Okay, masicele undwendwe lethu uba lungene kule question, asizukwenza nabe uqokelela ii-questions kuqala. Sathi nje kwenza incoko. Thank you.
Yeah. Enkosi kakhulu ngezo nangamazwi wakho ndiyabulela kakhulu. I think for me the first step ekufuneka niyenzile it's really for getting someone senior from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development in the province, or someone from COGTA. I wouldn't necessarily say COGTA, I think the department, because they have to sort of like granularize for you the programs that they have in the province for development, both for new entrants, farmers, community-related aspects, so that you can see where you can tap in. And I think in the process of that, because they are still merged, the departments, land reform and rural development, the key question the point they need to also bring in line is to say, in the land that is in the Eastern Cape as part of the 2.5 million hectares that I was talking about, undawo nilamhlabe Eastern Cape, ukweziphi idolophu, and ke ngoku nakwezinye provinces bayigranularize kanjalo. And I think the minute they do that, you begin then to see some of the opportunities obungayaphi now. Because ultimately, provinces of Eastern Cape, into enhle ngayo yoba ungalima nantoni na. Of course, wenza fruits nendoni kwindawo tropical as is towards the coast, ezinye indawo ezinawo amanzi noba azikho tropical, but uphinde ube nayo imfuyo all across. A lot can be done well. And I think beyond that conversation, which is where then I was coming in with the COGTA, I do think that we need to entertain the idea, Ayoba, in the areas as Zilali, with all of our former homelands. For how long are we going to have these homelands looking the way they look now? Because the reality is that between today and in year 2000, nothing has changed kwindawo ezininzi. If anything, of course, kwakhiwe kukho izindlu ezinhle, imizi iyakhula yonke loo nto, but in terms of the actual development, there is not a lot of production and a productive activity esizenzayo. To the extent now that you find that many of our communities live on remittances that are coming from other cities and sending the money down. I do think that we have to, broader than was commercial, but think about how do we begin to introduce agriculture in a much more fundamental way, as well as industry, the auto space and the others, even if it's for fixing and not necessarily for bringing the entire auto industry on that. But the point is that we need productive industries within the former homelands regions of South Africa. And iTranskei, enye indawo efuneka sithethe ngayo eprovincini uba what do we do there? So it's a two thing. One, the fact that we can do much of the crops. Of course, what we can plant nesivuno esingaphuma phi will differ as basitesta imihlaba nentoni na. Kodwa ephondweni nase-KZN nasempumalanga uhlala usazi uba into ezininzi zingama kakuhle nemfuyo ingakwazi uma kakuhle apho. But I think i-conversation nabantu basephondweni malunga nento zomhlaba, malunga nee-programs abanazo, it's a very useful one and an essential one that we should have. And I think after that, as my last point, I would say, we do also need to have someone that can come and talk about the aspects of the funding. But I think we cannot invite anyone to talk about the funding until you clarify the land structure of the Eastern Cape, the uses that are possible, what's where and what can be done. And then we'll begin to think broadly about the funding. And through these dialogues, then perhaps some plans and some imagination will come about what are the practical things that can be done. But I think with the current status quo, eyona nto yenzekayo ngoku abantu bakha emadlelweni. Uzabona kukho imizi kwindawo yonke kungekho ndawo yakudlisa imfuyo. And in part, it's because of this unplanned development and thinking about what exactly are we doing within our communities. Thank you.
Ngosi John, like any other self-respecting party nkqubo ke John, nam ndinayo eyam imibuzo while silinde AmaNdungwana uba anike imibuzo. Nangu umbuzo wam wokuqala John, khawusithathe usise kwi-history yakho, ukhula kwakho nje wena nje personally. Yintoni ebangele uba ubone le nto kuthiwa yi-agricultural economics iyinto ebalulekileyo? Kwenzeke njani uze ibe yi-opportunity kuwe? And also xa ujonga umepisha ukhula kwakho, ujonga just ordinary young people these days, zinto abangaziboniyo as out there, which are just obvious kuwe.
No, I mean, yeah, this is, I always try. I never really think about you're asking me a difficult question. I never really reflect on my on what I'm doing. But let me just say this, which I think will be useful. I mean, there are a lot of opportunities, because I think many people, whenever we talk about the farming space, broadly, people think about farm. But xa kuthethwa nge-farming, sithetha ngayo ne-value chain ye-food, fiber, and the beverages, backwards as well as forward on that. Because abantu can get their degrees on IT-related things, on science degrees, on technical stuff. All of that will be required in any of these industries, because ultimately, the food, fiber, and beverage is a manufacturing industry. And then kube khona naba farming, and amafama wona kuqala, there's a lot more related to the science degrees that are related, that are needed there, in addition to the technical skills that are there. So the point is that the jobs aspect in the value chain of agriculture, food, fiber, and the beverages industry, it's so much and so vast. And I think that people have to entertain that fact. And even if you are in a legal degree, by the way, you can do your legal degree like any other aspect, and you end up being a company counselor in some of these companies. Either it's a food processor or beverages ones or whatever, but there's a lot more of the opportunity that is there. But I think what would be useful is thinking about someday where we have a conversation and outlining quite clearly about what are some of those critical skills that are needed there and what will be needed going forward on those aspects. As to why did I do the agriculture economics and all of those things? I mean, like everything in life, more of the fortune and luck of deciding where to go, and largely then being fortunate throughout the aspects. But what I would say is that the economics part of the degree assists a lot on moving and being useful in terms of the policy aspect of the sector, which is very important, but not only policy related to agriculture, because I mean, economics is economics. You apply it on any other aspect, and you can move from agriculture and be a mining economist and on all other things that will be needed, because the degrees in large part, they will be general on that. And I guess this links back to ulucha of saying, where are the opportunities? What must they be studying? And what is that looking like? And I think somewhere when it's mid-year, closer to grade 12, those are some of the conversations that are useful, along with the things related to scholarships for students, and those are conversations that we could perhaps have. Ngoskakhulu.
Inkosi Mhlekazi. Yes, masicele ke AmaNdungwana abantu abanemibuzo Ucofe nje phaa uphakamise isandla, kanti ke if awukwazi ukwenje njalo, vula nje wena imic ungene. Thank you. Okay, andikabona imibuzo. Okay, okay, nangu Sosibajikele.
Thanks, question. So another critical observation I've seen upper emakhaya is that there's a growing trend whereby I'll call them investors for now, where they are coming to the homelands. Bafune baboleke imihlaba so that they can grow whatever they want to grow. Mr. Sihlobo, what's your view on that, as well as I'm asking what's your view, maybe because I'm worried that abantu bethu, the idea of equipping them so that they can be able to become fully fledged and competent farmers, even commercial farmers, it's being challenged by this, because people will come, say we want so many hectares of land, sizawunipha imisebenzi, and then sizawunika loo peni sizawunika yona. Somehow I think that goes against what the NDP is trying to do. And then also the second point is the co-op operating model. What's your view on that? Do you think the co-op model is working well, or are we as the people that are part of co-ops understanding the bigger picture? Because what I've noticed is that people who are part of co-ops somehow they are just producing whatever they are producing just for a short period of time, and then thereafter the machinery is sitting there. They don't have the expertise or the funds to maintain the machinery, etc., etc. They end up living from hand to mouth. It's as if it's a project, whereas those co-ops, ideally, they were supposed to enable our people so that they can be able to have sustainable development, if I can put it like that. Thanks. That's that from my end.
Yeah, I think thanks so much for that. I mean, I think on the first point about the investors, I think it's important that we pay a bit more attention, of course, firstly to what people are there to do, coming from where, and all of those things. I think they become important, that due diligence before they come in. But technically, the communities don't even have the full right of actually leasing land to other people, because we are largely, much of the land that we're operating in the former homelands belongs to the state. So you, of course, the chiefs are the custodians of that, and the politics around that. But I think for me, what we need to do on that, at some point, a conversation about land governance is important, but not only just for the grouping, but the broadly as South Africa and around that. But I would be wary to put a blanket slate and say, this is how one could think about the people that do come to say, hey, we want to put investment in some of these areas. A lot of those depend on a case-by-case approaches about how to judge those scenarios and what people are presenting to the communities, and whether then you do see a broader good that could come out of that interaction. And I think those are all the judgments that you begin to make as things evolve on that. Similarly, with the co-op situation, I mean, I think the issues around the co-op, there are some that can be a wonderful success, but there are some that cannot be a wonderful success. It all depends on a governance structure of it. Let me give you an example. If you look at, for example, Withhold, banga go Willowvale, uzawufika ubona pha uba umama Gloria Serobe and the colleagues benza umsebenzi oncomekayo kakhulu. They've done amazingly well in all of their activities, and Withhold is growing and communities are involved and everything else. But the other one, you can look at the Forte Dairy farm structures and what ends up happening there. Some communities are involved in terms of leasing the land. They're not really involved directly in farming. And there's another model that also comes out of the area. I think studying those models and seeing which one works. And similarly to the first point, it all depends on the individuals that are there, the structure that is put in place, the type of activity that is going on. But ultimately, we must encourage a situation where land and the other thing are transferred to individual ownership where possible, because then that assists a great deal on ensuring that the levels of security and the investment and the focus is there. Because if then other people are not focused, they can end up weighing on all of this activity that the co-op wants to do. And that can lead to all kinds of bad things that we have all read about. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let's give a platform to Mr. Dr. AmaNdungwana.
Andazi noma ndiyavakala na.
Uvala kakuhle mfethu, uvala kakuhle.
Yes, we can do it, but
Enkosi dear. Thank you very much, Qengeba. I think the information you shared with us is very fruitful on a Friday afternoon. My question is twofold. The first one, I would like to pick your brain on because you mentioned something about the issue of policies. And there's a new act now that the National Treasury is busy with in terms of the regulations for the Public Procurement Act. Now, I want to hear your views in terms of how can the state use that to assist Black farmers or Black startup in the agricultural sector. Then the second question to you is, having the exposure that was given to you in the CV when we started initially, what is your view about access to finance? Because you are right when you say we used to farm in the villages back then, but you know how we farmed. Some of us ke siqale sakhokhela inkomo siyoboleka ibhulu sibophe izipani zibe zintandathu okanye zibe 8, but kule mihla banqabile abantu abakwazi banaso nezipani ezibini kwa uqala ulima. That means ke ngoku uthi usasuka kufuneka ube nemali leyo uthenga idizili yoqasha itractor, and itractor ulima umzekelo ihectare 1 uzawucela 500 rand, awukayifaka imbewu, awukahlakula. Now that means to go and uye emasimini, the upfront costs are quite high, and now we don't have access to those costs. And what can be done to bridge that gap? Because the white counterparts, you'll find that even on the stats that you've shown, and you rightfully said there that it's only 10% of the Black people that are participating in that economy. So in essence, we cannot then claim that the agricultural sector has prospered in South Africa, because in actual fact it has not prospered for us. So what do we do to make sure that it prospers for us? Because it's the same as the other sectors. Whether you go to ICT, you go to built environment, you'll find that it's still the white people. And the challenge that we've got is that we don't have access to finance. Lastly, as AmaNdungwana, there's a project that was initiated. I don't want to mention the numbers, but if you look at the initial costs, that just to plow 2.5 hectares, it's in the excess of 3 to 4 to 500,000. Now, if you ask someone to have that amount of money upfront, and then umbuzo uba umama wakhe yintombi yaphi, yayizalwa phi, yona yayingumamni, enkosi Qengeba.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. Let me try to answer before ndicela indlela. We are sitting somewhere here in between meetings here in the Free State. I think on the first point, I will skip that and not make a comment on it now, because it's always also contingent on the farmers also having the produce and the whole thinking about procurement and the other things. But ultimately, I mean, you want the black farmers to be able to produce and at a competitive level, so that they can be able not only to be reliant on the state in terms of the procurement, but in the other channels that do exist there in the market, either for retailers or otherwise, or for the export side. But of course, procurement in terms of the hospitals, the school feeding schemes, prisons, and all of those are useful things, which I think that at a regional level, small and medium scale farms should be benefiting on that. And in a second point, and that's an important aspect, but I think we will need to dive on that on that procurement space the sooner we have thought about how do we boost the production. And I think this transitions me to your second point, because you make an important point there, but I want to also intervene to say, look, when I say agriculture has prospered 30 years in democracy in South Africa, we cannot discount it. White people are South Africans themselves, just as we are. Everyone holds the same right on the ID or on the passport. But you are 100% correct to say these disparities and these two agricultures needs to be confronted head on, so that the prosperity is shared. I think what you are seeking, which I would say it's an underlying point of you, Doc, is to say, how do we begin to have a shared prosperity? I think that's the essence of your question, Doc, about this shared prosperity aspect. And I think then on the shared prosperity aspect of it, as well as the financing, if you are small and in the smallholder farm or subsistence farm and doing not for the commercial purposes, the only aspect of getting through that, we're going to have to work with the food security section of the department if we are looking for financial support about how to do that. But my focus and an encouragement where Amon is to say, how do we begin then so that people can produce and produce more for their commercial use, which is where the blended finance that I was talking about comes in. But unfortunately, the blended finance is not going to come into the subsistence part unless we can demonstrate that we'll be able to produce something, to put it out on the market and get some money back and be able to repay the part of the loan. Because I mean, it goes up to, so far we have it at 80 million rands maximum for one transaction. So other people don't even need those money. They need about a 200,000 rand, way less than that. But all of those, the minute then you go less than 100,000, it begins to be moving to food security, where it comes on as those interventions that they can make. But I do think that in that aspect, there's also an issue of information asymmetry between our communities and the officials that are supposed to be serving in these communities. Because you yourself will remember that we used to have Traco and the others. Traco had a wider reach. Since those programs were taken off the table, we haven't had the current officials, Zifana, and having a skill that used to be there in the past. And I think for subsistence side, that skill set and that type of help is useful. But for those that are looking at saying small commercial scale, medium, and eventually going on large scale, I think tapping into all of these affordable funding instruments begin to address your point. And of course, the blended finance of the government is one example. There's a whole menu of the other financing aspects and the CSI funding that comes from the mining industry and the others that we will need to think innovatively about some of these things. It can't be a one-way answer of answering it, but I think there's a lot of things that are there in the financing. But ndizawukhawuleza ngicela indlela ngoba bendimxelela umzala nomphathi inkqubo uba andichophe endleleni apha kukhona into esizozenza no minister apha eFree State, but bendingafuna ukukhansilisha le ntlanganiso ibaluleke kakhulu. Ndingaqonda uba andizawungena kodwa ndizongena ndihlale lonke ixesha ngale ndlela besigqibe ngayo, and ndiyayixolisa loo nto leyo. Ndimane ndijonga abantu abamane bevela apha bezondifuna, kodwa mandithathe nje one question emva koko ndicela indlela.
Mandibulise, andiyazi noba ndiyavakala okanye noba ndivelile na. Mntakahlobo, ndizuba mde sesiyivile into yoba ngabana uleqwa lixesha endingenelayo, andingenela imibuzo. Ndikubulisa kuwe, ndibulise kumbhexeshi wale nkqubo, ndibulise nakuMaNdungwana onke. Okwam nje kufutshane kukwenzela ukubulela. Amapedi athi ukutya kakhulu ke akukho yoyisa indlala. Besesivene ngento yoba le fireside yokuqala lena, so asinawuzigqiba zonke izinto ngemini enye. So ndizama uthi ke kuwe Jola ngalo mazwi, umzi wakwaNdungwane wonke ubeke izandla entloko, uthi matholanywa ngande kukudlelana. Siyabulela phopho ngalo mxhamsholo, siyabulela kakhulu. Sondlile thina, sinethemba loba ngabana ke sizawumane siqhuba ngolu bambiswano. Sizawumane ke ngoku siyiqhekeza nganye kuba namhlanje zibe nkulu kakhulu intloko zethu zingagqabhuka ezinye baloku siyaqala uyivala into ingaka uba nkulu. Ngalo mazwi siyabulela yaye siyakukhulula. Sisithi nakuMaNdungwana onke angenileyo, enkosi Mandungwana, masimkhulule umntakasihlobo, sizawuphinde sidibane naye xa sithe savana ngelo xesha elo. Cama kuba.
Enkosi kakhulu, ndiyabulela kakhulu, enkosi.
Kuhle ke Mandungwana.
Sosiba uyasikhulula sonke uba singabaleka nathi. Sihlalo ikuni ngoku kumkile umntakasihlobo, andazi noba nathi niyasikhulula na.